How much of a challenge are wildfires to Europe? Rapidly spreading blazes are scorching the continent, destroying forests, farmland, homes, and businesses. They're becoming bigger and more difficult to control. So, what's fueling the flames? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Europe is still burning. From Spain to France and from Italy to Greece, wildfires are destroying everything in their path. Crews work around the clock to contain them, but the fight is far from over. Rising temperatures and prolonged droughts create ideal conditions for the flames to spread rapidly and burn more intensely. Scientists and environmentalists say extreme weather events like this should be a wake-up call for European policymakers, a sign of the challenges that lie ahead. So, how catastrophic could the situation become before the fires are brought under control? We'll talk to our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Michael Apple.
These heavy-lifting helicopters are called water bombers. They're in such demand that landing is a luxury. There's no time to waste. In the forest-covered hills of the village of Vilia in western Greece, water bombers fly mission after mission in the battle against wildfires. They're racing to contain the flames spreading near the capital Athens, where crews have been working for several days. As well as Greece, fires are also burning in parts of France, Spain, and Portugal, with an estimated 330,000 residents and tourists displaced and moved to safety. Between January and the end of July, more than 1,400 detected fires destroyed almost 435,000 hectares of land, releasing about 18 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Hot temperatures, dry vegetation, and strong winds are fueling one of Europe's most severe and destructive fire seasons in recent years.
A major effort is underway with lots of emergency personnel. I believe we will succeed, but a big battle has taken place.
The damages in France alone are expected to exceed more than $17 billion. And unlike floods and droughts, wildfires are not covered by the state-backed Natural Disaster Compensation Scheme. In parts of the southwestern Gironde region, some people have been allowed to return home, but only to salvage what's left, if anything.
We're going to see our house, which completely burned down. I've already seen it, but my partner hasn't, and so the shock will be quite hard. Seeing photos versus reality is not the same. There's nothing left of our house. Our whole life has been wiped out.
In Bordeaux, the fires have uncovered a hidden danger. Munitions, buried in time, now exploding in the heat. Experts warn that the effects of climate change need to be treated with caution as much as urgency. Heat waves are happening more frequently and lasting longer. Erratic weather events are increasing. Some environmentalists want to use this devastation to drive fresh momentum in calls for greater adaptation, prevention, and crucially, government action. Michael Apple, Aljazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests from Lemnos Island in Greece. We're joined by Paleologos, Paleologou. He's an associate professor of forest protection at the Agricultural University of Athens. Marta Yebra is in Australia's capital, Canberra. She's the director of the Bushfire Research Centre of Excellence at Australian National University. And in Terrassa, in Spain, we have Carlo Buontempo. He's the director of the Copernicus Climate Change Service. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Thanks for joining us today on Inside Story. Carlo, let me start with you today. We know that it is an exceptionally hot summer throughout Europe. How much are you attributing what is happening right now, including the wildfires, to climate change? How much is climate change supercharging all of these conditions?
Well, for sure, climate change is playing a role in some of the extreme weather we have seen, because it's not just the heat in the middle of the summer. Actually, the heat at the beginning of the summer, even at the end of the spring. We started with a heat wave in May, followed by a series of heat waves between June and July. But it's also what happened before, because a lot of the impact we are experiencing now, especially in relation to forest fire, have also to do with a relatively warm and wet spring and wet winter that we had before. So as always with climate change is one factor among many, but it's clear that the kind of weather that we are experiencing now is becoming more frequent, more intense. It will last longer, and it will generally happen early in the year as a consequence of climate change. And this is entirely aligned with the expectation made by climate scientists even just a couple of decades ago. As the climate warms up, so a specific region, in this case, what is in the front pages of the newspaper is the condition in Europe, but it was Canada a few years back, or the US, in California before. As the climate warms up, this kind of condition will become more frequent. The heat wave will become more intense, will last longer, and will happen early in the year.
And Carlo, you're talking about what we see in the headlines, on the front pages of newspapers, the fact that the climate is warming up. Look, we hear a lot that Europe is the world's fastest warming continent, and that is obviously a major factor in contributing to these wildfires at this time. But why? I want to ask you why Europe is the world's fastest warming continent. What are the underlying factors there?
Well, as always, is a combination of factors. We have identified some of those. Possibly the list is not complete, but we believe that in the first instance, we are talking about a continent, and we do know that land generally warms faster than the ocean. So when you compare Europe or any other region, land region, with the global average, you compare an area that is covered by land with an area of the globe that is mostly ocean, actually. So you would expect land to warm faster. So this is not specific to Europe, it's specific to any sort of land. When you look at Europe specifically, one of the elements that certainly plays a role is the fact that in the European domain, the geographical domain we call Europe, there is a significant fraction of the European Arctic, and in particular the Arctic Ocean. We do know this is one of the fastest warming regions on the planet, also because of the sea ice albedo feedback. So we lose sea ice, we expose the dark ocean, which has absorbed way more radiation than the relatively bright ice or snow on top, and so exacerbate the problem. There are also other elements, some of which are maybe more indirectly related to climate change. If you look, for instance, at the kind of weather we are experiencing this summer, so this pronounced high-pressure ridge that dominate east, western, and then central Europe, well, this kind of event, this kind of circulation patterns have become more frequent in recent years. So certainly this has contributed to a warmer summer in the European domain. And finally, there is a more conjectural argument, but certainly an important one to make, and it's the fact that Europe has been quite good at reducing air pollution. And reducing air pollution also means removing a lot of the particulate matters, the aerosol that is in the atmosphere. This may have actually made our atmosphere more transparent. So while generally better air quality is a positive for our health, and certainly this has saved a lot of life, may have, at least locally, contributed to an increase in the climate change signal. So these are some of the causes we think could be responsible for a special warming of the European region with respect to other continents.
Marta, I saw you nodding along to some of what Carlo was saying. That looked to me like you wanted to jump in and add to the point he was making. So please go ahead.
Yes, look, I totally agree that climate change and global warming is contributing, but it's not the only factor. But also some of the factors we've been learning in Australia over very painful experience of bushfires as those that are happening in Australia now is that we can only rely on suppression alone. So these conditions that we see happening these days mean that we need to fundamentally rethink how we prepare for bushfires. So in Australia, for example, the Royal Commission led for major reforms where we gave a lot more emphasis on nationally coordinated risk information and preparedness, not just on emergency response. So Australia has also invested very heavily in fuel management, including prescribed burning, and we are increasingly recognizing the value of indigenous cultural burning and thousands of years of land management knowledge that these communities have had. So we recognize that these approaches are also very important. But one lesson, again, we have learned is that they are no universal solutions under catastrophic weather conditions, as we have explained before. The effectiveness of these technologies can really be reduced. So they need to be combined with better science and technology for community preparedness and landscape-specific management.
Marta, let me pick up a little bit on what you were saying there, because I was reading about the project that you spearheaded, where you and your team brought this combined knowledge from Australia's Indigenous communities and you combined it with satellite imagery to help detect where fires are more likely to break out going forward. From your vantage point, could this type of model be applied to Europe in the future to help it combat wildfires?
Look, satellite information provides comprehensive information across the landscape on where and when areas in the landscape are prone to fires and ignitions. So this information, of course, is specific to different countries. Different fuels respond differently. But what is important is local knowledge, whether it is indigenous knowledge, is knowledge from land managers in the specific communities, is local knowledge that can be used to calibrate and validate those estimates from the satellites, because ultimately satellites provide a comprehensive view at landscape scale, but they are observations that behind have models to produce information. So that information needs to be validated and calibrated by local knowledge. In Australia, we have started to use to work with indigenous communities to cross-calibrate the estimates of the satellite, but also to recalibrate the indigenous knowledge. So indigenous Australians have been observing the landscape flammability for millennia in Australia, and they know very well what indicators are in the landscape that tell them that the land is ready to burn. But with climate change, again, some of those indicators have disappeared or are hard to track. So that's why indigenous communities have also found a great advantages in using this satellite data, because they can see the dynamics of the landscape very clearly and see how the dryness developed over time with warming conditions.
Paleologos, from your vantage point, how much of a challenge are wildfires to Europe right now? And why, from your perspective, is the situation particularly bad at this moment?
Look, I won't disagree with the colleagues that with what they say earlier, but in Greece we have a different story this year, and this is what surprised me and struck me, and I can say that I was frustrated, because there is no effect of climate change in this fire season. We have a very cool summer. We had a very wet period before the summer, so no heat waves at all. The situation in Greece has nothing to do with the situation we see and experience in the United Kingdom, in France, or in Spain. So we were expecting that we won't have large fire this year, and to my disappointment, we have large fires. And these fires are wind-driven, and are wind-driven by winds that have been talk about them for centuries. So we know that these winds happen every summer in Greece. So it is one of the usual cases of winds, and we have large fires, almost mega fires that burn our landscapes. If you see the map, you can see that a lot of fires happen on the vicinity of Athens, around urban center, where people live and where people have more pressure, not only for the touristic business, but also for recreational use. So we see a very strong correlation with where people live. And we know for a fact that most of the fires that happen in Greece, more than 70%, happen due to negligence or to some sort of human activities. And another 20%, that is something that hasn't been talked much, and recently we start pushing forward this so that we can protect our forests, is the fires that are created by the network of transmission, the power, including the networks, the private networks that transmit the power from the renewable energy sources. We have a documented case now in Greece that one of these networks created a fire that gets uncontrolled. So although we have normal conditions, we have more ignitions on the landscape. And this ignition happen because people don't have the risk awareness that they should have. They still not realize that things have changed. Things in Europe were different 50 or 70 years ago. People used to live in the villages. Now half of the population of Greece lives outside Greece. I know many of my friends that are moving to Australia or to other parts of other continents. So we see a depopulation of the landscape. These people and their forefathers used to live the same in Spain, the same in France, and the same in Italy, used to live in these landscapes, used to manage the forest without the help of the state. They have their donkeys, they have their goats, they remove the fuel from the forest. Now all these places are abandoned. And after the abandonment, the forest and the nature encroach and takes over the place that used to be taken over from nature by the people. So we have denser forests, more fuels, and combined with climate change, we get uncontrolled fires that we cannot stop. Not a single, and this to conclude, not a single firefight mechanism can stop a fire like the one that happened in France that created this pyrocumulonimbus that creates its own weather. It's impossible to throw water. It's impossible to do a lot of things. So you have to wait for the conditions to change, and that's a major problem.
Carlo, I see you're reacting to what Paleologos is saying, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. It's always a combination of factors, and there are many factors that have nothing to do with climate change, including the change in the landscape, in the use of the landscape, in the population, in the management of the forest. These are all very important elements modulating the risk. At the same time, it's clear that the climate we are experiencing now, let alone the one that will come in 10 or 20 years from now, is a climate that has very little parallel to the one in which our ancestors lived. We are fundamentally in a different world. If you look at the heat waves that hit the UK early this year, we're talking about 40 degrees in southeast England in May or early June. That's completely unprecedented. If you look at the heat wave or even the forest fire that have hit northwestern France, Brittany, or even the Netherlands, these are not regions that were historically prone to forest fire and became at risk also because the condition in which we are living now, the temperature, but also the level of drought in some of this region actually have very little resemblance or parallel with historical conditions. So I guess this also links back to the Australian experience to some extent, because there is somewhat a limit in what our indigenous knowledge, even in Europe, can teach us, because we are out of our experience, out of our historical setting. And so we need to rely more on the information coming also from other sources. I mean, we are talking about satellite before, but more and more we need also to rely on the elaboration of this information coming from satellite through modeling, through supercomputing, through exercise that give us an imperfect, but still useful and usable guidance on what may lay ahead. And I think that's part of the opportunity we have here. I mean, the situation is dire in many respects. It's very challenging. It's probably one of the biggest challenges we have ever faced as a species. And still we are not blind in front of it. We never had so much information, so much high quality information that can guide our action. We do know some of what will happen next. Not everything. It's still, in many respects, a challenge to make predictions for the future in any field. In the field of meteorology and climate change, actually we are better than in other fields. We have a bit of a glimpse of what might happen next. And I think as a society we can take better advantage of this incredible information we have in guiding our actions.
Marta, Carla, they're saying that society should be taking better advantage of the information at our disposal, and I see you reacting to that. What do you say? What are the steps that need to be taken in order to mitigate all this going forward?
Well, I think, as my colleague said, there is a lot of information, but sometimes it's harder to get that information into the hands of the people that it actually needs. And that's because it takes a lot of time to build confidence in new information and new systems. We do a lot of work on emerging technologies. And when it comes to emerging technologies, there is a lot of new technologies that now can be used to predict the fires and detect fires early. Of course, one of the issues we could address is to get to the fires early, not let them grow to this catastrophic size. So the early we get into the fires, the highest the chances of an initial attack success, while it's small. So there are a lot of technologies out there, but and most of them are very promising. So I think the technology is growing very quickly. But another aspect of the coin is how those technologies can be trusted, can be evaluated, can be benchmarked with current technologies or practices that are used in emergency services. So again, they can build trust to make specific decisions. And for that, we need very long-term partnerships to integrate these technologies into the operations. And of course, that cannot happen in the middle of an emergency. That needs to happen out of the emergency when the land managers have time to test and trial these technologies. But it is also true that the funding periods for technological developments and implementation usually comes after the disasters. And we don't learn enough to make sure that is the times where we are in the calm without disasters, where we need to work harder into this integration and evaluation of technologies so we get better prepared for the disasters.
Paleologos, we heard earlier in Michael Appel's report that there are, of course, environmentalists who would like to use the devastation that we're all witnessing in order to build momentum in calls for greater adaptation, prevention, government action. Do you think that we're going to be seeing that happen?
It's a story that we hear every summer, after summer in Greece. And although we've seen that a lot of progress have been made, most of the times when the winter comes, people tend to forget. During the momentum now, we can push to get some new funding or some different approach in how we manage fire. But I'm afraid that people forget very fast, and we should not let them forget what happened, especially in Western Europe. It is time to take more measures, and we need not to focus on the boutique project. That's my biggest fear. There are a lot of projects being funded across Europe, but they are very wrong in terms of scale. Their scale is so low, so out of the scale of a fire that it cannot match the fire when it happens, and it cannot make a difference. So we are throwing money away without making a big difference. And the big difference can happen only if we start thinking about taking landscape measures. Again, when the people used to live in the villages and all around Europe, all around, I live in an island now, it has 70,000 people. It used to have more than 40,000 people. People were packing all the island. So there was much competition and everybody took care of their own land. Now this land, who's gonna manage it? The state needs to step in and take the responsibility of managing these landscapes. But the amount of money that we require to do this landscape fuel treatments or the change of landscape to make it more resilient, they are enormous, and we need people. And my biggest fear is that because we don't have people, we will start asking for money, and a lot of consortiums ask for money, that eventually they won't make the change as it should be. So my suggestion is that the National Forest Service agencies or the National Fire Management agencies need to focus on where using the technologies. And we are using technologies like fire simulations, we are using modeling, we are using scenario planning, tests how we're going to allocate in the best possible way with a limited funding the treatment so that we can make the biggest difference, to focus on certain areas and start picking the low-hanging fruit. Let's go to the areas that need our attention first, around Bordeaux, around Athens, and then we move next year in next area, in another area, so that we can treat the landscape at a level that it can become resilient. If you treat at the levels lower than the nature and the fire wants, then you will have fires that you cannot stop with suppressing operations.
Paleologos, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I mean, you're talking about potential worst case scenarios here and the fears you have going forward. I just want to ask you a little bit more about that. We only have a couple of minutes left. How much worse might this current catastrophe get before all of this is brought under control, or before, precise measures are taken to stop this from happening going forward?
We have, if the trend continues like that, for example, in the past 7 years in Greece, we lost almost 500,000 hectares of forest. If we continue with that trend and we start getting fires in higher elevation systems where they are not fire adapted, then we're going to lose much of the forest that they don't have the capacity to regenerate. So we need to act fast. We don't have much time. Again, around Athens, there was a fir forest, a forest that takes more than 100 years to regenerate. It burned during the 2007. No forest is there now. There are some other forests that they have more regeneration capacity. So we need to act fast if we want to save these high elevation forests or ecosystems or protected areas that they do not have the capacity to regenerate. Otherwise, we will lose this ecosystem and all the benefits and the ecosystem services that come from this area. So we don't have much time. We need to not focus only on the suppression. We are spending too much on suppression, and we need to spend maybe half of this money in prevention, because for €1 that we spend in prevention, we save €10 from suppression and €100 from the reparation and all the rehabilitation effects that we need to take. So the prevention is the only strategy. Otherwise, we're going to fail.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Paleologos, Paleologou, Marta Yebra, and Carlo Buontempo. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in just a moment. Stay tuned.